Hello. This video will help you prepare for the Unit 2 Formative 1 review. I will go over topics including the distributive property and factoring, combining like terms, and writing expressions or equations. First, let's talk about distributing and factoring. The two problems in red I am going to distribute, and then the two problems in blue I am going to work in reverse, which is called factoring. The first problem is -4 times the quantity r minus 6. I am going to multiply the number on the outside times everything on the inside of my parentheses. So first I think of -4 times r, which is -4r. And then I'm going to think of this as a -4 times a -6, which is a positive 24. And that's it. I'm done. I can't simplify that anymore. The second problem is 8 times the quantity 3 minus g. Again, I take the number outside of my parentheses and I multiply it by my first term. 8 times 3 is 24. And then again, I think of that as 8 times a -g, which when I multiply a positive and a negative, it's negative. So that would be 24 minus 8g. Now, the two problems in blue, I'm going to work in reverse and factor. So if I look at 3c and -12, I know that I can divide both of those by the number 3. So I'm going to factor out or divide both of those by 3. And if I take 3c divided by 3, it leaves me only with c. And then if I think of a -12 divided by 3, that leaves me with a -4. So then that means that I have 3 times the quantity 3 minus 4. If you wanted to double check this and make sure that they are equivalent, you could redistribute. 3 times c is 3c, and 3 times -4 is -12. You can see that I started with the exact same thing up here, so I know that that answer in white is correct because I double checked it. The second problem in blue, -20h plus 30. Again, I want to look for anything in common that I could divide or factor out of both of those. And I know that I can factor out a 10. However, that first one has a negative, and since that one has my variable, I don't want a negative variable. So if I actually factor out a -10, -20 divided by -10 would leave me with a positive 2, and don't forget about that variable, the h. Then if I look at 30 divided by -10, that is a -3 or -3. And again, you could go back and redistribute that and make sure that you end up with the expression that you started with. Simplifying and combining like terms. This part is my favorite. Look at the first question, x plus 5x. We normally don't write ones in front of our variables, but you could for the sake of remembering. There is one x there, and when you add 5 more x's to it, you end up with a total of 6x. The next one, 3 plus 4b minus 18 plus a -5b. I am a fan of starting with my variables first, and I always include the operation symbol out in front, so I remember how to find my total. So on this one, I have a positive 4b's, and I'm adding -5b's to that. Well, I'm just going to fall back on my integer rules, and I know that if I have a positive 4 and a -5, that leaves me with a -1. And I have b's in there, so it's -b. Again, you could put a 1 in front of it, but it's not necessary. It's just -b. Then I go back and I look. There are my constants, or whole numbers. And there I have a positive 3 and a -18. When I put positives and negatives together, I subtract. 18 minus 3 is 15. I keep the sign of the larger number, which is negative, so my new expression is negative b minus 15. Down on the bottom, I have 5 times the quantity, 4 minus z, plus 9z minus 7. Well, the first thing that you have to do here is distribute. So I'm going to take 5 times 4, which is 20, 5 times a negative z, which is negative 5z, and then I'm just going to drop down my extra stuff. Then I can go back and look for my like terms. I like to do my variables first. So again, I include my operation symbols out front so I don't forget what I'm doing. So now I look at this as a negative 5 and a positive 9. When I put those together, it's a positive, which you don't really need. So I'm just going to write it as 4z. And then I go back and look. I have a positive 20 and a negative 7. When I put a positive 20 and a negative 7 together, I get a positive 13. And then that is in simplest form. And last but not least, I have to distribute 6 minus 3 times the quantity 4a plus 5 plus 2 times the quantity a minus 7. Always, always, always distribute first. So I'm not going to do anything with my 6, but I'm going to drop it down so that I don't forget about it. And then I'm going to distribute this like a negative 3. Negative 3 times 4a is negative 12a. Negative 3 times a positive 5, negative 15. Now I'm going to look at this as a positive 2 over here and distribute that. 2 times a is 2a. 2 times negative 7, negative 14. Now I can go back and I can look for like terms. First, I'm going to do my variables, and I use my operation symbol out front. And that is a negative 12a plus 2a, which those are opposites, so you subtract. That leaves me with negative 10a. Then I go back, I'm going to grab a different color here. I have a positive 6, a negative 15, which when I put those together would be negative 9. And then I put my negative 9 with a negative 14, which would be a negative 23. Of course, since technically you are adding all of those together, you could put your negatives together first and say you have 15 negatives and 14 negatives, which is a total of 29 negatives, and then cancel that out with your 6 positives. You would still get left, or you would still have negative 23 left over. And that is your final answer on that final combining like terms problem. Last but not least is being able to write equations from information given to you in a table. So the direction says write an equation to show the relationship between the number of questions and the time it takes. So they give you 4 examples. If there are 2 questions, it takes 10 minutes. If they give you 3 questions, it's going to take 15 minutes. 4 questions, 20, 5, 25. But they haven't given you all the questions. What if you go home one day and you have 12 questions? You could figure out how long it's going to take if you have an equation written. So what you want to do is define a variable, and they give it to you, Q and T. And if you look here, there's a constant relationship. For every question asked, it takes 5 minutes to answer. If you take 5 times the number of questions, it equals the amount of time that it takes. Or you could write that in reverse order. If you start with the amount of time it takes, if you start with the time and you go backwards, you see that you divide it by 5, and that would give you the number of questions that you have. The big thing to remember is that when it asks you to write an equation, it must have an equal sign.